Welcome to the Explainer. Today, we're doing something a little bit different. We're going to act as textual anatomists to uncover the structural skeleton of one of history's absolute most famous ancient texts. We're looking at Matthew 6:25 through 33, and we're doing it through the lens of Dr. David Bauer's inductive Bible study methods. We aren't just reading it today, we're going to X-ray it, literally mapping the very architecture of its logic. Now, this text feels incredibly familiar, right? Do not be anxious about your life, what you shall eat, or what you shall drink. You have likely heard that 1,000 times. But today, we're looking way past that familiar surface to see the hidden mechanical gears turning underneath. When you read a text this well-known, it is so easy to just glide right over the profound logical structure the author is building. So how exactly do you uncover the hidden logic of a 2,000-year-old argument? Well, to answer that, we've got to use a methodical, academic process to peel back the layers of the text. It requires transitioning from just a casual, general reading down into granular, logical breakdowns. We kind of have to treat the text like a finely tuned machine, taking it apart piece by piece to see exactly how the gears of its argument interlock to drive the main point home. Section 1. Anatomy of an argument and the tools of detailed analysis. Okay, so a detailed analysis isn't just passive reading. It's mapping the architecture of the material to see exactly how every single thought connects. Dr. Bauer emphasizes that to truly understand logical argumentation, tracing this flow of thought is absolutely essential. We aren't just looking at what the words say, but how they actually function structurally. If you want to perform this textual X-ray yourself, these are the progressive steps you gotta follow to strip away the skin and reveal those logical bones. You start by observing the context, zooming out to see the general structure, then breaking it down into smaller subdivisions, and finally assigning logical labels so you can understand the exact rhetorical moves being made. Moving on to Section 2, the macrostructure. We like to call this the textural sandwich. Think of the passage like a sandwich. Notice how it begins in verse 25 with an initial command. That's the effect. Then it dives right into a large middle section giving the reasons for that command. That's the cause. And finally, it loops back to final commands, which is the effect again. It's a highly structured, deliberate movement. Effect to cause and straight back to effect. The meat of that sandwich is what academics call hortatory substantiation. I love this term. It basically means the author doesn't just issue a command and expect blind obedience. Instead, they systematically prove exactly why you ought to do it. The text is quite literally saying, hey, here's what you should do, and here is the ironclad logical proof as to why it makes perfect sense. Section 3. Two spheres of care, internal versus external. By contrasting the internal need of ingestion with the external need of clothing, the text creates a holistic, all-inclusive scope of human necessity. The author is speaking of two very specific spheres here: the sphere of life, requiring internal ingestion like eating and drinking, and the sphere of the body, requiring external wear like clothing. It covers the inside and the outside. Literally no basic human need is left unaddressed. The underlying structural logic here implies that creating life and the human body out of absolutely nothing, well, that was the incredibly hard part. Therefore, providing the subsequent food and clothing to sustain them, that's guaranteed. Think about the logical contrast of extent here. If God went through the massive effort to create life, he absolutely has both the ability and the will to provide the comparatively simple food and clothing required to keep it going. Section 4, from lesser to greater, the logic of provision. This logical label, argumentum a fortiori, is the absolute engine driving the text's proof against anxiety. It literally means argument from the stronger. The idea is simple. If an incredible thing is true in a minor, lesser case, how much more certainly must it be true in a major, greater case? Let's break down exactly how the text applies this. Applying that lesser to greater rule to the sphere of life, just look at the birds. The text notes they don't perform agricultural labor. Sowing, reaping, gathering into barns. Historically, that was male-dominated labor. Yet God feeds them. If God sustains the lesser birds, the logic dictates he will surely feed the much more valuable human being. Now, applying the exact same rule to the sphere of the body, we look at the lilies. They don't perform the historically female-dominated labor of toiling or spinning thread, yet they totally outshine King Solomon. If God lavishly clothes temporary, fleeting grass that's just thrown into the oven tomorrow, he will most certainly clothe you. The logical breakdown here highlights that anxiety is simply a symptom of weak faith in this basic logic. Look at the total completeness of this argument. The text doesn't just throw out random examples. It encompasses the heavens and the earth, flora and fauna. It dynamically moves from providing mere basic survival, feeding the birds, to providing extravagant, glorious beauty that actually surpasses royalty. God's care, the text structurally argues, is total and complete. Section 5. The logic of anxiety, the internal dialogue. The Greek verbs here are actually fascinating. Back in verse 25, the command is a present imperative, which functionally tells the reader to stop an existing state of anxiety. But then, down in verse 31, it shifts structurally to an aorist subjunctive, which warns against even starting the process. It's a really subtle linguistic shift from addressing an ongoing habit to just cutting it off before it even forms. Notice how this direct discourse functions as a toxic internal dialogue. The text says, "Do not be anxious," saying, and then quotes these specific questions. What shall we eat? What shall we drink? It perfectly captures that exact narrative loop that plays out in our heads the second panic sets in. This right here captures the true psychology of the text. Anxiety is framed not just as some external force acting upon us, but as an isolating internal conversation. We literally talk ourselves into worry. Instead of looking outward to the God who feeds the birds, we look inward and just echo our own fears back to ourselves. Section 6. The final synthesis, the ultimate resolution. Before the final command, the text offers one last piece of substantiation. It contrasts two groups. The Gentiles, who represent those outside the covenant, anxiously seek after material things because they just don't have the assurance of a provider. But you have a heavenly Father who is completely aware of your needs. He has the ability, he has the will, and, crucially, he has the exact knowledge of what you require. The text concludes its structural sandwich with a positive command that introduces a subtle but massive shift from anxious internal dialogue to active seeking. Notice the transition. It doesn't just say stop worrying and do nothing. No, it replaces the negative, paralyzing habit of worry with a positive, outward-focused action, seeking the kingdom. As our X-ray analysis concludes today, it leaves us with one final interpretive question to ponder about what it truly means to put the kingdom first in the hierarchy of our daily pursuits. Is it an absolute priority, where it's the only thing we seek, or is it a relative priority, meaning it's the absolute highest goal in a natural hierarchy of human needs? By structurally dissecting this ancient argument, we don't just understand it better, we are forced to answer the brilliant logical challenge it presents. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep seeking that structural clarity.